The bells of St. Margaret's had not yet finished their ninth toll when the doors opened. She came in on his arm, Vivienne Clary, dressed in deep emerald silk that had no business being worn to a Sunday service, and every intention of being remembered. The Duke of Ashford walked beside her with the particular ease of a man who had decided, sometime between Friday evening and Sunday morning, that he no longer cared what anyone thought. Society noticed. Society always noticed. But it was not the silk that stopped the vicar's hand mid-turn of his Bible page. It was the brooch. Small, oval, seed pearls arranged in a delicate ring around a painted miniature no larger than a shilling. A woman's face, rendered in the style of 30 years past, with dark eyes that had not belonged to anyone living for a very long time. Reverend Thomas Hale had buried the woman in that miniature. He had stood at her grave in winter rain and read the words of comfort he had believed at the time were true. He had shaken the hand of her grieving husband and said nothing of what he knew. He had kept a letter in the church archives for 23 years, sealed in brown paper, waiting for the correct moment. His hand did not tremble. He was too old for trembling. But his eyes moved slowly, deliberately, from the brooch to the back of the church. To the woman seated alone in the last pew, half hidden beneath the brim of a dark bonnet. The Duchess of Ashford looked back at him with an expression that told him, quite clearly, that she had been waiting for exactly this moment. She had simply been waiting for him to see it first. Elizabeth had not opened the box in 4 months. This was deliberate. There were things in life that required distance, grief, old letters, the particular scent of a mother who had been gone long enough that the memory of her was now more precious than the pain of her absence. The brooch lived in a cedarwood box inside the locked drawer of Elizabeth's writing desk, and Elizabeth had made a habit of not looking at it too often, the way one learns not to press a bruise. She had last opened it on the 23rd of March, her mother's birthday. She had held it for a few minutes in the pale morning light, traced the pearls with her thumb, looked at the miniature face that shared her own jaw and her own stubborn set of the mouth, and then she had placed it back, locked the drawer, and gone downstairs to breakfast. On the 14th of April, 3 weeks later, she had gone to the drawer for her correspondence. The key had met no resistance. Elizabeth had stood very still in the doorway of her own sitting room for a long moment. Then she had walked to the desk, sat down, and opened the drawer with the careful movements of someone who already knows what they will find and is simply confirming it. The cedarwood box was there. She lifted the lid. Empty. She sat with the open box in her hands for perhaps 5 minutes. She was not a woman given to dramatic responses. Her mother had raised her to consider the full dimensions of a situation before reacting to any part of it, and so she considered. Someone had a key, or someone had forced the lock with sufficient skill to leave no visible damage. The drawer showed nothing. The box showed nothing. Only the absence itself was evidence, and absence, as any solicitor would tell you, was the most difficult thing to prove. She thought about going to the Duke. She dismissed the thought almost immediately. Ashford would deny it. He was very skilled at denial. It was perhaps the talent she had come to know best in him over 6 years of marriage. He would look at her with that particular brand of bored patience he reserved for her concerns and suggest that she had misplaced it, or that one of the maids had moved it for safekeeping, or, and this was his favorite, that she was allowing her emotions to cloud her recollection. He would not shout. He never shouted. He simply made her feel that the ground beneath her was slightly less solid than she had believed it to be. Elizabeth had learned, slowly and at some cost, not to give him that satisfaction. She closed the box. She locked the empty drawer. She kept the key. And she waited. This, too, was deliberate. Elizabeth had been waiting for 3 years, not for the brooch specifically, but for something. Some miscalculation on his part. some moment in which Ashford's certainty that she would remain quiet and contained and conveniently invisible would cause him to reach too far. He was not a stupid man, but he was an arrogant one, and arrogance, in her experience, had a way of making intelligent people careless. She simply had not anticipated that, when the moment came, it would be her mother's face that announced it. The brooch had belonged to Lady Miriam Calloway, née Ashby, who had died in the winter of 1809 at the age of 51, leaving behind a daughter, a complicated estate, and a reputation for quiet dignity that had outlasted most of the people who had known her. Elizabeth had her mother's eyes and her mother's patience, and she had come to believe her mother's particular understanding of when not to speak. Lady Miriam had given Elizabeth the brooch 3 days before she died. "Your grandmother wore this to her own wedding," she had said, pressing it into Elizabeth's palm with fingers that were already too thin. "And I wore it to mine. It has witnessed a great deal of disappointment, this little thing, but it has also witnessed survival. I want you to have it, not to wear, you needn't wear it, but to know that it exists, that the women before you existed, that they endured and were not diminished by the enduring." Elizabeth had been 22. She had not fully understood. She understood now. What she did not yet know, what she would not learn until a Sunday morning in May, in the last pew of St. Margaret's, watching the vicar's hand go still over his Bible, was that her mother had understood far more than she had ever said aloud, and that she had made arrangements accordingly. Elizabeth had been 20 years old when she married the Duke of Ashford. She had known, going in, what it was. Her father had not dressed it in sentiment. He was a practical man with 3 daughters and an estate that had been quietly bleeding money for a decade, and he had sat Elizabeth down the week before the engagement was announced and spoken to her plainly, which she had always respected him for, even when she had not liked what he said. "Ashford needs an heir and a name that doesn't embarrass him," her father had told her. "You need security and a household. This is a reasonable arrangement between 2 families who understand each other's position. I will not pretend it is more than that, and I trust you not to pretend either." Elizabeth had nodded. She had asked 2 questions: whether she would be permitted to keep her own correspondence private, and whether her mother's properties would remain in her name after the marriage. Her father had looked at her with something that might have been pride, negotiated both points into the contract, and poured them each a small glass of sherry. That had been the most honest conversation she had ever had about her marriage. The Duke of Ashford, Richard Hale Montclair, 5th Duke, decorated veteran of the Peninsular War, possessor of 3 estates, and a reputation for cold competence that society found both impressive and faintly alarming, had been 34 at the time of their wedding. He was not cruel. Elizabeth had always been careful to acknowledge this, at least to herself, because it seemed important not to construct a villain where there was simply a man who had never found her particularly interesting. He had wanted an heir. She had given him one, a daughter, born 14 months after the wedding, which had not been what he wanted. A second pregnancy had ended quietly in the spring of the following year. After that, Ashford had retreated, not dramatically, not with any declaration, simply with the gradual withdrawal of a man recalculating his investments. He had become polite in the specific way that people are polite to those they have decided are no longer relevant to their primary concerns. Vivienne Clary had appeared approximately 2 years into the marriage. Elizabeth had known about her within the month. This was not difficult, servants talk, and Elizabeth had always treated the staff at Ashford Park with sufficient decency that they talked to her. She had received this information in the same way she received most unwelcome information. She had sat with it alone for an evening, felt whatever needed to be felt, and then organized it into something she could work with. The arrangement that existed, unspoken, between herself and the Duke was this: he maintained the public forms. He appeared at the necessary functions, acknowledged her precedence, did not humiliate her in direct and obvious ways. She, in return, managed his household with the efficiency he depended upon, and never caused him the particular social embarrassment that a difficult wife could cause a man of his position. It was not a marriage, it was a management structure. Elizabeth had made her peace with this, not happily, not without cost, but with the particular thoroughness of a woman who has decided that resentment is an indulgence she cannot afford. She had built a life inside the margins she was given. She had raised her daughter. She had read widely and written daily, and maintained a correspondence with 3 women of similar intelligence whose friendship had become, over the years, more sustaining than she could have anticipated. She had been, in the language her mother would have used, enduring. What she had not anticipated, the thing that had, in fact, shaken her in a way that the empty cedarwood box had not, was the day Ashford had brought Vivienne to the park. It had happened 6 weeks ago. The beginning of April, the countryside still raw and gray with the end of winter. Elizabeth had been in the garden when the carriage arrived, and she had watched from the path, unseen, or at least unacknowledged, which at Ashford Park had long since become the same thing. As Vivienne Clary stepped out and looked at the house with the proprietary interest of a woman being shown a property she is considering purchasing. Ashford had said nothing to Elizabeth beforehand. No warning, no negotiation, no acknowledgement that this represented a crossing of the one line that had always existed between them. London was London. The park was Elizabeth's house, not legally, not on paper, but in the way that a space becomes a person's through the years of tending it. She knew every room. She had chosen every arrangement of furniture in the East Wing after the flood of 1814. She had planted the rose garden herself, with her own hands, the spring after her daughter was born. And he had walked Vivienne through it, as though Elizabeth were simply part of the furnishings. That night, alone in her sitting room, Elizabeth had understood that the arrangement had changed. Not because of Vivienne. Vivienne had existed for 4 years, and Elizabeth had accommodated that reality with something approaching equanimity. But because of what this gesture meant. Ashford had stopped calculating. He had stopped maintaining even the pretense of the forms they had agreed upon, and he had done it without warning, without negotiation, without the courtesy of even informing her that the rules had shifted. He had become careless. And a careless man, Elizabeth had learned from her mother, was a man who had already begun to make mistakes. She had gone to her desk that night and written 2 letters. One to her solicitor in London, a careful man named Mr. Pruitt whom she had retained independently, and whose existence Ashford was not aware of. The other to an old friend of her mother's, a woman of 70 whose memory for legal details was, Elizabeth had always found, extraordinary. Then she had locked the letters in her correspondence box, gone to bed, and slept with the soundness of a woman who has stopped waiting and started moving. The brooch had been taken 3 weeks later. By then, Elizabeth was almost grateful for it. Reverend Thomas Hale had kept the letter for 23 years. This was not, he had told himself at various points over those 23 years, dishonesty. Lady Miriam had given it to him with specific instructions, asterisk, when the time is correct, Thomas. You will know the time, and the time had not until this particular Sunday morning in May presented itself with sufficient clarity. He had waited. He had watched. He had conducted the baptism of Elizabeth Calloway and later the marriage of Elizabeth Calloway to the Duke of Ashford, and he had stood at the altar on that wedding day and seen something in the young woman's eyes that had made him think of her mother and feel, for the first time, that the letter's moment might be approaching. But it had not been time yet. He had known Lady Miriam for 31 years. She had come to St. Margaret's as a young bride, already quieter than a young bride ought to be, already possessed of that particular stillness that women develop when they have learned that the world responds better to their silence than to their speech. Her husband, Lord Calloway, had been a man of considerable charm and considerable selfishness, and he had died 6 years before Lady Miriam, without apparently troubling himself to feel guilty about either quality. Miriam had come into herself after his death. This was the version of her mother that Elizabeth had known, the composed, clear-eyed woman who spoke plainly and gave good counsel, and wore the brooch on feast days with something that looked, to those who knew her well, like defiance. But Thomas had known the earlier version, the younger woman who had come to him in the vestry on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 30 years ago, with a sealed document and a request. "I need you to hold something for me," she had said. "Not in the house, not where he can find it." She had not needed to specify who she meant. "What is it?" Thomas had asked. "Insurance," she had said, "for Elizabeth. She is 7 years old and she does not know yet what kind of world she will inherit. I would like her to have something in it that cannot be taken from her." Thomas had taken the document. He had read it at her instruction, so that he would be able to speak to its contents if ever called upon to do so. Then he had placed it in the church archives, behind the register of marriages from 1787, and he had not looked at it again for 23 years. He knew what it contained. Lady Miriam's instructions had been precise, as everything about her had been precise. The brooch was to pass to Elizabeth upon her mother's death, and from Elizabeth to Elizabeth's eldest daughter, and it was never, the word had been underlined twice in Miriam's careful hand, never to be sold, pledged, transferred, gifted, or removed from the possession of its rightful holder. The penalty for violation was not merely moral. Lady Miriam had been a woman who understood that moral penalties meant nothing to certain kinds of people. She had made it legal. The brooch was attached to Elizabeth's inheritance by a covenant that predated the marriage contract. It could not be touched by a husband's authority because it had been structured, with the help of a very discreet solicitor, to exist entirely outside the bounds of marital property. It was Elizabeth's the way her own name was Elizabeth's, not a possession but a right. And there was more. Thomas had reread the document in his vestry on the Thursday before that Sunday, because something in the way Elizabeth had looked at him across the congregation in recent weeks had told him the time was, at last, becoming correct. He had sat with Lady Miriam's words in the afternoon light, and understood, not for the first time, that she had been a far more formidable woman than most people had ever suspected. The covenant covered not only the brooch. It covered the entirety of Lady Miriam's personal bequest to Elizabeth, a small estate in Wiltshire, the income from 2 tenanted farms, and a sum of money that had been quietly accumulating interest in a separate account for 23 years. All of it tied to the same condition, written in the same careful hand. "Provided that the marriage of my daughter Elizabeth remains one of dignity and mutual respect. Should evidence emerge that her husband has acted in deliberate and public disregard of her position and honor, the full bequest reverts to Elizabeth's sole and independent control, regardless of the terms of the marriage settlement." Thomas had read that clause for the first time 23 years ago and thought, "She is protecting her daughter from a future she cannot yet see." He understood now that Lady Miriam had seen it very clearly. What he had not known, what surprised him when he thought about it, was how patient Elizabeth had been. 6 years of marriage, 4 years of knowing about the mistress, 6 weeks of having that woman installed in her own house. And Elizabeth had said nothing to him, had given no indication that she was aware of the document's existence, had attended his services each Sunday with the same composed attention she had always brought to them. Until the brooch appeared on another woman's lapel. Until their eyes met across the church, and he understood, from her expression, that she had not come to St. Margaret's this morning despite being unwell, as the household had apparently been informed. She had come because she had known this would happen. She had known, and she had wanted a witness. Thomas closed his Bible. He delivered his sermon. He shook 37 hands at the door, including, with steady composure, the hand of the Duke of Ashford and the gloved hand of Vivienne Clary, who smiled at him with the confidence of a woman who had never once considered that a country vicar might be the most dangerous person in the room. He did not shake Elizabeth's hand. She was gone before the last of the congregation had filed out. But she had stopped beside him for exactly 4 seconds on her way to the door, her voice low and clear beneath the sound of the departing crowd. "The letter, Thomas." Not a question, not a request. A confirmation. Thomas watched the Duke hand Vivienne into the carriage. He watched the carriage pull away down the lane. He watched the churchyard empty in the pale May sunshine until there was no one left but himself and the graves and the sound of rooks in the elm trees. Then he went inside, walked to the back of the church, and retrieved the document from behind the register of marriages from 1787. He sat down at his vestry desk, and he wrote a letter to a solicitor in London. Richard Montclair, 5th Duke of Ashford, was not a man who made obvious mistakes. This was, in fact, the thing that had made him difficult to outmaneuver for the entirety of his adult life. He was not reckless. He was not impulsive. He had survived the Peninsular War, 3 parliamentary committees, and a financial crisis in 1812 that had quietly ruined 4 men of his acquaintance. And he had done all of it through the same quality that had defined him since boyhood, a cold, patient capacity for calculation that left very little to chance. He had calculated Elizabeth. He had done it before the engagement, during the negotiation, and throughout the 6 years of the marriage itself, and his calculations had consistently returned the same result. She was manageable. Intelligent, yes. He had never underestimated her intelligence, which was more than most men in his position would have conceded. Observant, certainly, but ultimately contained by the same forces that contained all women of her class and circumstance. She had no independent income of consequence. She had a daughter to protect. She had a position in society that depended entirely on his name. And she had, most usefully, a temperament that ran to silence rather than confrontation. He had never once seen her lose her composure. He had taken this as passivity. This was the miscalculation, not the brooch. The brooch was merely the instrument. The miscalculation was this. Richard Montclair had spent 6 years watching Elizabeth not react and had concluded that she was not acting. He had confused her stillness with absence. He had looked at a woman who was quietly, methodically, patiently preparing and seen instead a woman who had simply accepted her situation. He had seen what he expected to see. The brooch had been Vivienne's idea, and he had permitted it with the particular laziness of a man who has stopped thinking carefully about a problem he believes he has already solved. Vivienne had wanted it. She had seen it once, through the open door of Elizabeth's sitting room, and had fixed on it with the tenacity she brought to anything she decided she wanted. "It's sitting in a drawer," she had said. "She never wears it. She'll never even notice." Richard had known this was not entirely true, but he had also known that Elizabeth would not make a scene, and a scene was the only thing that concerned him. He had given a key to William, his most discreet footman, with instructions that were not instructions, merely a suggestion, accompanied by a 10-pound note, that certain drawers in the Duchess's sitting room might benefit from being opened, and their contents rearranged. William had understood, as good servants always understand, exactly what was being asked without anything specific being said. The drawer had been opened. The brooch had been delivered to Vivienne on a Tuesday evening in April. Richard had watched her pin it to her traveling coat with the satisfaction of a woman who has won a small battle, and he had felt nothing in particular, neither triumph nor guilt, simply the mild relief of having resolved an irritant. He had not thought about it again until Sunday morning. He had not, if he was being honest with himself in the privacy of his own recollection, thought about it at all. That was the nature of miscalculations. They happen precisely in the spaces where you had stopped thinking. The first indication that something was not entirely right came at church, and it came from the vicar. Richard had known Thomas Hale for 30 years. He knew his face the way one knows the face of any fixed feature of a landscape, without particular attention, but with the ability to notice when something about it has shifted. And something about Thomas Hale's face, when his eyes moved from Vivienne's lapel to the back of the church and back again, had shifted. Richard had not turned to look at the back of the church. Later, he would identify this as the moment when he should have paid attention. A man of his usual precision would have turned, would have registered Elizabeth's presence in the rear pew, would have understood from that single data point that the morning was not proceeding as casually as he had assumed. But he had not turned, because he had already decided that Elizabeth was at home, in bed, with the mild indisposition that her maid had reported to his housekeeper that morning. He had accepted this information with satisfaction. It was convenient, her absence, and he had carried that assumption into the church and sat with it through the entire service and out the other side. He had shaken Thomas Hale's hand at the door. The vicar had looked at him with an expression Richard could not immediately classify. Not hostility, not quite, something more deliberate than that. "Your Grace," Thomas had said, and nothing else. Richard had handed Vivienne into the carriage and thought no more about it. The letter arrived on Wednesday. It came from a firm of solicitors in London, not his solicitors, which was the first thing that caught his attention. Prewitt and Associates, Chancery Lane. He did not recognize the name. He broke the seal with the letter opener on his desk and read it standing, which he later thought was appropriate, because sitting would have implied a comfort he would not have felt. The letter was brief, professional, almost gentle in its precision, the way that very serious legal documents sometimes are. It informed him that a covenant attached to the estate of the late Lady Miriam Calloway had been registered with the court, and that certain conditions of that covenant appeared, on the basis of evidence currently being assembled, to have been violated. It informed him that the brooch described in the covenant's inventory had been identified in the possession of a third party. It informed him that the full terms of the covenant, including the provisions relating to the Wiltshire estate, the tenanted farms, and the accumulated funds, would be presented at a hearing scheduled for the 14th of June. It was signed by Mr. James Prewitt, solicitor on behalf of his client. His client was listed as Elizabeth Ann Montclair, Duchess of Ashford. Richard set the letter down on the desk. He sat. He thought, with the careful, methodical attention he brought to problems that actually required it, about the past 6 years, about Elizabeth's silence, about her composure, about the letters she wrote at her desk in the evenings that he had never thought to wonder about her mother, whom he had met only twice before her death and dismissed as a gentle, faded country woman with no particular significance, about a vicar whose hand had gone still over a Bible on a Sunday morning, about a woman in the back of the church that he had not turned to look at. He sat with all of this for a long time. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and went to find his own solicitor. He was already, though he could not yet fully articulate it, aware that he was behind. The morning after the letter arrived, Richard came to Elizabeth's sitting room. He knocked. This alone was notable. In 6 years of marriage, he had not knocked on her sitting room door more than a handful of times. He had simply entered, or more commonly, sent a footman with a message. The knock was a recalibration, Elizabeth understood, a small, tactical adjustment. He was reassessing her, and the knock was the first evidence of it. She was at her desk. She set down her pen. "Come in." He entered and stood near the door with the posture of a man who has decided to be reasonable. He was very good at this, at presenting reasonableness as a form of generosity, as though his willingness to be calm in a situation of his own creation were itself a kind of gift. "Elizabeth." "Richard." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. She had spent the previous evening preparing for this conversation, not by rehearsing speeches but by deciding with great precision what she would not say. She would not mention the brooch directly. She would not mention Vivienne. She would not reference the letter or Thomas Hale or her mother. She would not raise her voice or allow any expression onto her face that could be characterized afterward as emotional. She would let him speak. He would reveal in his speaking exactly how much he understood, and more usefully, exactly how much he did not. "I received a communication from a solicitor," he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. He had expected, she thought, some form of reaction to this, surprise or anxiety, or the particular defensive flutter that women were expected to produce when confronted with legal terminology. She offered him nothing. "Pruitt," he said, "I wasn't aware you had retained independent counsel." "There are likely a number of things you weren't aware of," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Would you like to sit down?" He did not sit. This was also telling. Sitting would have implied a conversation of equals, and he had not yet fully accepted that this was what was happening. He was still, some part of him, expecting to manage this. "The covenant your mother apparently established," he said, "is something I intend to have examined thoroughly. My own solicitor is of the opinion that its enforceability is," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "questionable." "Mr. Pruitt has a different opinion," Elizabeth said, "as does the court, given that they have accepted the filing." Another pause, longer this time. She watched him recalibrate again. He was doing it visibly now, which was new. He had always been better at concealing the machinery of his thinking. The letter had rattled something loose. "This can be resolved quietly," he said. "That would be preferable for everyone." "I agree entirely," Elizabeth said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not relief, not quite. More the cautious attention of a man who has reached for a door and found it opens differently than expected. "You agree," he repeated. "I have no interest in a public dispute," she said. "I never have. I think you know that." "Then, I would like the brooch returned," she said, "by Friday." Silence. "The rest," she continued, "we can discuss through our respective solicitors as is appropriate. I have no objection to a quiet resolution. I have every objection to an unjust one." He stood very still. This was the moment. She could feel it, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, when he was deciding how to respond. There were several versions of Richard Montclair available to him in this moment. There was the cold version, the one that had made her feel for years that she was standing on uncertain ground. There was the reasonable version, which he had entered the room wearing. And there was a third version, one she had seen only occasionally over 6 years, that she thought of privately as the honest one. The one that appeared when he had run out of better options, and the pretense of managing a situation had become more costly than simply acknowledging it. She watched him choose. "The brooch will be returned," he said. And then he left. Elizabeth sat for a moment after the door closed. She was aware of a sensation that was not quite triumph. Triumph was too loud for what she felt. It was something quieter. The particular satisfaction of a thing falling into its correct position after a long time spent waiting for the angle to be right. She picked up her pen. She had a letter to write to Mr. Pruitt. What society saw in the days that followed was very little, and this was precisely the problem, from society's perspective. There had been an expectation after that Sunday at St. Margaret's of a scene. The Duchess of Ashford had been in that church. Several people had seen her leaving, had registered her presence in the rear pew, had begun assembling the story with the eager efficiency that society brought to assembling stories. The Duke's mistress had worn something belonging to the Duchess. The vicar had noticed. The Duchess had been there. Surely something had happened. But Elizabeth appeared at the Hartley dinner on Thursday looking precisely as she always looked, composed, well-dressed, unhurried. She spoke to Lady Hartley about the Rose Garden. She discussed a novel with the eldest Hartley daughter. She ate her soup. She did not mention the Duke. The Duke did not appear. Vivienne Clary, it was noted by those who paid attention to such things, was also absent from the Hartley dinner, and from the Pembridge card party, and from the Thursday afternoon promenade where she had made a point of being visible every week for the past month. Something was happening. It simply was not happening where anyone could see it. This was, for those who had anticipated a confrontation, deeply unsatisfying. For Elizabeth, it was entirely the point. She had learned from her mother that the most powerful moves are the ones that happen in rooms other people are not in. Scenes were for people who had no other recourse. She had recourse. She had a solicitor and a covenant and 23 years of her mother's careful forethought, and she intended to use it with the same quietness with which she did everything else. The confrontation they were all waiting for was not going to happen. What was going to happen was considerably more permanent. On Friday morning, a small parcel arrived at Elizabeth's sitting room. She opened it at her desk alone. The cedarwood box, the seed pearl brooch inside, exactly as she had last seen it, the miniature face looking up at her with her mother's dark eyes and her mother's composed expression. Elizabeth held it for a long time. Then she placed it in the box, locked it in the drawer, and kept the key. There was more work to be done before she would wear it. The 14th of June arrived with the particular indifference that important days often have: gray sky, mild air, the smell of recent rain on the London streets. Nothing in the weather acknowledged that something was ending. Elizabeth had been in London for 10 days. She had come up quietly, without announcement, staying not at Ashford House on Grosvenor Square, which was Richard's house, had always been Richard's house in every way that mattered, but at the Pulteney Hotel on Albemarle Street, where she had taken a suite of rooms under her own name and tipped the staff generously enough that her presence would not become a topic of conversation. She had brought her lady's maid, her correspondence box, and a single trunk of clothing selected with the attention of a woman who understood that how one looked in the next several weeks would be observed and interpreted and remembered. She had not brought her daughter. Margaret, 15 years old, currently resident with Elizabeth's eldest friend Mrs. Caroline Ashby in Bath, did not yet know the full dimensions of what was happening. She knew that her mother was in London for legal matters. She knew that things between her parents were, as she had phrased it in a letter to Elizabeth with the directness that Elizabeth had always encouraged in her, rather more serious than usual. She had asked, with the same directness, whether she ought to come. Elizabeth had written back the same day. "Stay in Bath, study your Italian, trust me." Margaret had written back 3 words. "I always do." Elizabeth had kept that letter in her correspondence box, in front of everything else, where she could see it when she opened the lid. Mr. James Prewitt occupied rooms in Chancery Lane that smelled of old paper and linseed oil, and the particular mustiness of a space where serious things had been happening for a very long time. He was 61, small, precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. Not because he was cold. Elizabeth had come to understand over 2 years of correspondence, but because he had spent 4 decades in rooms where giving things away was professionally ruinous. He had been her mother's solicitor first. This was something Elizabeth had not known until 18 months into her marriage, when she had written to him on the advice of Mrs. Caroline Ashby. Your mother trusted him completely, and your mother trusted no one carelessly. And he had responded to her first letter with a warmth that had surprised her, and then with a sentence that had not surprised her at all. "I have been hoping you would write, Your Grace. Your mother asked me, some years ago, to make myself available to you when the time came. I am glad the time has come while I am still in sufficient health to be useful." She had sat in her sitting room at Ashford Park and read that sentence 3 times. Her mother had known. Of course she had known. Lady Miriam had watched her own marriage with clear eyes for 30 years. She had watched the world with clear eyes for 51. She had given Elizabeth the brooch and the words about endurance, and she had also, quietly, with the practical love of a woman who understood that sentiment without strategy was simply grief, arranged the furniture of Elizabeth's future so that there would be something solid to stand on when the ground shifted. Elizabeth had wept, alone in her sitting room, for the better part of an hour. Then she had written back to Mr. Prewitt, and they had begun. The hearing on the 14th of June was not a public trial. It was a proceeding before a master in chancery, a closed room, legal representatives, documents, the careful machinery of equity law grinding through its necessary motions. Elizabeth sat on one side of a long table with Mr. Prewitt and his junior, a young man named Fellows who took notes with extraordinary speed. Richard sat on the other side with Sir Edmund Carew, his solicitor, and a barrister whose name Elizabeth did not retain because she had already read his written arguments and found them, as Mr. Prewitt had predicted she would, inadequate. Richard looked at her once when she entered. She met his gaze briefly, pleasantly, and looked away. This was not performance. She genuinely felt, sitting down in that room, a kind of clarity that she had not experienced in years. The clean, uncomplicated sensation of being exactly where she had intended to be, doing exactly what she had planned to do, with the full weight of her mother's forethought behind her. She was not angry. She had been angry at various points over 6 years, but anger was a fire that consumed the wood it needed to keep burning, and she had learned to use it carefully and then let it go. What she felt now was something more like resolution, the particular piece of a thing arriving at its correct conclusion. Sir Edmund opened for Richard's side with the argument Elizabeth had anticipated. The covenant was irregularly registered, predating the marriage settlement in a manner that created legal ambiguity. The transfer of the brooch had been an internal household matter, and not a public act of the kind the covenant's language required, and the broader provisions relating to the Wiltshire estate were contingent on conditions that had not been sufficiently demonstrated. He spoke for 22 minutes. He was, Elizabeth noted, very skilled. He made Richard's position sound almost reasonable, which was the most that could be done with it. Mr. Prewitt spoke for 38 minutes. He was not theatrical about it. He did not raise his voice or employ the kind of rhetorical flourishes that barristers sometimes use to disguise the weakness of their arguments. He simply presented, in sequence, with the patient precision of a man who had been building this case for 2 years, and had no intention of leaving any part of it undemonstrated. He presented the covenant itself, registered, witnessed, dated 1801, predating the marriage settlement by 4 years and structured specifically to exist outside its terms. He presented Lady Miriam's instructions to Thomas Hale, corroborated by the vicar's sworn statement. He presented the testimony of William, the footman, who had, it emerged, been considerably more troubled by his actions than Richard had anticipated, and who had come forward to Mr. Prewitt's office voluntarily, 3 days after receiving a letter that Mr. Prewitt had taken care to ensure reached him, detailing the removal of the brooch from the Duchess's locked drawer on the Duke's instructions. He presented the statements of 4 members of St. Margaret's congregation who had seen the brooch on Vivienne Clary's lapel on the morning of the 15th of May, and could identify it from Lady Miriam's portrait in the church. He presented the sworn statement of Thomas Hale himself, who had known Lady Miriam for 31 years, had custody of the original covenant document for 23, and could speak to both its contents and his personal knowledge of the circumstances under which it had been created. And then, last, he presented the evidence of the broader violation. This was the section that cost Richard the most, Elizabeth thought, watching his face with the careful attention she had always given to things that mattered. Not the brooch was damaging, but it was containable, a single incident that a sufficiently creative legal mind might reframe. What was not containable was the pattern. Mr. Prewitt had been thorough. He had documentation of Vivienne Clary's installation at Ashford Park, the household accounts, the staff records, the correspondence that established her presence not as a brief visit but as a sustained residence in the Duchess's house over a period of 6 weeks. He had statements from 3 members of the Ashford Park staff, given, Elizabeth knew, not from disloyalty to the Duke, but from the rather more powerful loyalty that servants sometimes develop toward a mistress who has treated them with consistent decency over 6 years. That established the nature of Vivienne's presence and the manner in which the Duke had conducted himself during it. He had, in short, documented the precise conditions that Lady Miriam's covenant had anticipated. Should evidence emerge that her husband has acted in deliberate and public disregard of her position and honor. Richard's barrister raised objections at 4 points during Mr. Prewitt's presentation. The master noted each one and sustained none of them. The hearing lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. At the end of it, the master retired to consider the submissions. He returned in 40 minutes, which Mr. Prewitt had told Elizabeth beforehand was a very good sign. Long deliberations tended to indicate genuine uncertainty, and short ones tended to indicate that the preponderance of evidence had done its work. The covenant was upheld. The brooch was confirmed as Elizabeth's sole and inalienable property, its transfer having constituted a clear violation of the covenant's terms. The broader provisions, the Wiltshire estate, the 2 tenanted farms, the accumulated funds, were declared restored to Elizabeth's independent control, effective immediately, as per Lady Miriam's conditions. Richard would retain the Ashford dukedom, the entailed estates, and his title. He would also retain, though the master did not say this, the particular distinction of being a man who had been outmaneuvered by his wife's dead mother. Outside, on the steps of the building, Mr. Prewitt permitted himself a small, contained smile. "Your mother," he said, "was a very remarkable woman." "Yes," Elizabeth said, "she was." She stood for a moment in the mild June air, looking at the street, carriages, pedestrians, London conducting itself with its usual magnificent indifference to the private dramas occurring within it. She felt standing there the strangest sensation. It took her a moment to identify it. It was lightness. Not happiness. Happiness was a different thing, warmer and less precise. This was something more structural. The sensation of weight that has been present so long you have forgotten it is weight, suddenly and completely gone. She had been carrying the marriage for 6 years. She had carried the silence and the management and the careful calibration of how much space she was permitted to occupy. She had carried the particular loneliness of being in a household where she was necessary but not wanted, present but not seen. She had carried it the way her mother had told her, enduring without being diminished, and she had done it well, she thought. But it was extraordinarily pleasant to put it down. "What happens now?" Mr. Prewitt asked practically. "Now," Elizabeth said, "I write to my daughter." The letter she sent to Margaret that evening was not long. She explained, in the plain language she had always used with her daughter, what had happened and what it meant. She explained the covenant and her mother's forethought, and the Wiltshire estate that would now be theirs, hers and Margaret's, in the most independent sense the law permitted. She explained that the situation with her father would be managed through solicitors going forward, and that while their lives would change in several practical respects, certain things would not change at all. She would still be Margaret's mother. Margaret would still be, as she had always been, the best thing that had come from a marriage that had otherwise been largely an exercise in endurance. She sealed the letter and gave it to the hotel's messenger. Then she sat at the small writing desk in her suite at the Pulteney and looked out at the evening street and thought about her mother. Lady Miriam had sat in her own sitting room 30 years ago and looked at a 7-year-old daughter and understood, with the practical, unsentimental clarity of a woman who had been navigating a difficult world for a long time, that love was not enough. That affection without strategy was simply warmth with no roof over it. That the most useful thing she could give Elizabeth was not advice or comfort or even example, but architecture. The invisible structure that would be there, solid and load-bearing, when everything else shifted. She had spent years building it, a covenant here, a solicitor there, a vicar trusted with a letter, a brooch attached to a legal clause, each piece quietly placed, waiting. Elizabeth had not known, growing up, that she was walking on a floor her mother had laid. She knew now. She thought about the last conversation they had ever had, the thin fingers, the cedarwood scent, the brooch pressed into her palm with words about endurance and survival. She had thought, at 22, that her mother was giving her comfort. She understood now that her mother had been giving her a weapon. Wrapped in love, which was why Elizabeth had not seen it for what it was. But a weapon nonetheless. She sat at the desk for a long time, in the evening light, feeling the particular grief and gratitude that arrive together when you understand someone fully only after they are gone. Then she opened the cedarwood box. She looked at the miniature face. "I understand now," she said quietly to the empty room. She did not know if that counted as prayer. She thought her mother would not have minded either way. She closed the box and went to bed and slept, for the first time in a very long time, without anything to manage. The news moved through London the way all significant news moved through London in the summer season. Not in a single wave, but in a series of them, each carrying slightly more detail than the last, each interpreted according to the particular interests and allegiances of whoever was doing the interpreting. The first wave was vague. Something had happened between Ashford and his Duchess, a legal matter, chancery someone said, which immediately elevated it above the usual domestic unpleasantness. Chancery meant documents, meant property, meant something with teeth. The second wave carried the outline, a covenant, a bequest, a brooch. The third wave, arriving approximately 4 days after the hearing, carried Vivienne Clary's name, which caused the kind of sharp collective intake of breath that society reserved for moments when things it had long suspected were confirmed in a form it could openly discuss. And then, because no story travels without its geography, came St. Margaret's Church. The brooch on the lapel, the vicar's stillness, the Duchess in the rear pew. By the time this version had completed its circuit of the drawing rooms and card parties and morning calls of the London season, it had acquired the quality of legend, not distorted, exactly, because the essential facts were accurate enough but elevated, polished. Given the shape that good stories always eventually find, the shape that makes people want to tell them again. Elizabeth heard the various versions from a distance. She was still at the Pulteney, still in London, attending to the practical matters that the hearing's outcome had generated, meetings with Mr. Pruitt, correspondence regarding the Wiltshire estate, a visit from her friend Mrs. Louisa Fenwick, who arrived on a Tuesday morning with excellent pastries and the most accurate summary of the social situation that Elizabeth had yet received. "You are," Louisa said, pouring tea with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has already decided how this conversation will go, "the most talked-about woman in London, possibly in England." "I would prefer not to be," Elizabeth said. "I know, that is, ironically, making it worse. Everyone wants to know what you are going to do next, and you keep simply not doing anything dramatic, which is driving them absolutely mad." Louisa bit into a pastry. "Lady Beaumont held an entire dinner party last Thursday for the express purpose of discussing you. The centerpiece was discussed for approximately 4 minutes. You were discussed for 2 hours. What did they conclude? That you are either very clever or very cold, and that the two are probably the same thing." Louisa looked at her over the rim of her teacup. "They are not wrong on the first count." "And Vivienne." Louisa set down her cup with a small, precise click. "Gone," she said. "Left for the continent, I'm told. Bath was mentioned as a possibility first, but Bath is where people go when they want to be seen recovering, and I think she understood that no one was going to permit her that particular performance. The continent is more honest. You can simply disappear into it. Elizabeth said nothing. "Are you sorry for her?" Louisa asked, with the directness that had always been the quality Elizabeth valued most in her. Elizabeth considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "No," she said at last, "I am not sorry for her. I might have been once if things had gone differently, but she wore my mother's brooch to church." She paused. "There are certain things that make sympathy very difficult." Louisa nodded. "Fair," she said, and reached for another pastry. Richard came to see her on the Thursday. He came to the Pulteney, which was itself a statement. A duke calling upon his Duchess at a hotel was not invisible, and Richard was not a man who did anything accidentally. He was making a gesture. Elizabeth received him in the small sitting room of her suite, ordered tea, and waited. He sat this time. This too, she noted. He looked, she thought, somewhat older than he had at the hearing. Not dramatically, Richard was 50 and had always carried his age well, the silver in his hair the kind that society called distinguished and meant it, but there was something in his bearing that had altered. The absolute sureness that had always characterized him, the quality of a man who has never seriously doubted that the ground will hold, was subtly diminished. He held himself with the same posture, but the posture no longer quite matched his eyes. He had not, she understood, fully absorbed what had happened yet. He was in the process of absorbing it, and this was what it looked like. "I want to discuss terms," he said. "We have solicitors for that," Elizabeth said. "I know. I would like to discuss them with you first." He looked at her steadily, as a courtesy. She considered this. There was something different in the way he was looking at her, not warmth. She was not going to construct warmth where none existed, but something that had not been there before. Recognition, perhaps. The specific regard one gives to an opponent one has underestimated and will not underestimate again. "Very well," she said, as a courtesy. He was quiet for a moment, assembling his words with the care of a man who has recently learned that carelessness is expensive. "I would like Margaret to have the Ashford name without qualification," he said. "Whatever arrangement we reach between ourselves, I do not want her position affected." Elizabeth had not expected this to be his opening. She had expected property, conditions, some attempt to recover ground. "That is already the case," she said. "Her position has never been in question. It is yours I took issue with." Something crossed his face. It was not, she thought, entirely comfortable. "Yes," he said, "I understand that now." The silence that followed was the most honest one they had shared in 6 years of marriage. Possibly the most honest one they had ever shared. Elizabeth looked at her husband, really looked at him, with the attention she had largely withdrawn from him years ago and redirected toward more productive objects, and tried to find, somewhere in the architecture of his face, the man she had married at 20. She had not loved him then, but she had respected him in the qualified way one respects competence, and there had been, in the very early months, something that might have become more than respect if either of them had known how to move toward it. They had not known, or he had not wanted to. She was no longer certain which. "What do you actually want, Richard?" she asked. He looked slightly startled. It occurred to her that no one asked him this very often. "I want," he said slowly, "to resolve this without further damage to either of our positions. I want Margaret's season when it comes to be unclouded by this. I want—" He stopped, started again. "I want to have handled this differently. I am aware that wanting that is useless at this stage." "It is," Elizabeth agreed. "But it is the most honest thing you have said to me in several years, so I will note it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are not what I thought you were," he said. It was not an apology. It was not quite a compliment. It was simply an observation, offered with the directness of a man who has run out of more elaborate options. "No," Elizabeth said, "I am not." She poured him tea. He accepted it. They sat in the small sitting room of her hotel suite and drank tea in a silence that was, for the first time in their marriage, not hostile or managed or carefully constructed to avoid anything. It was simply quiet. It was the closest they had ever come, she thought, to being two people in the same room. The terms were negotiated over the following 3 weeks by Mr. Pruitt and Sir Edmund Carroll, with the particular thoroughness that results when both sides have been reminded that corners cut now tend to reappear later at inconvenient angles. Elizabeth would retain the Wiltshire estate and its income in full, independent of marital property and beyond any future claim. The accumulated funds Lady Miriam had set aside, 23 years of quiet growth, were transferred to Elizabeth's sole account, again independently. She would maintain her title and precedence as Duchess of Ashford in all social contexts. She would continue to manage Ashford Park if she chose to, because she had spent 6 years making it into something worth managing and saw no reason to abandon it, with full authority over the household. Richard would retain the dukedom, the entailed properties, the London house. Vivienne Clary's name did not appear in any document. She had already removed herself from the situation with sufficient thoroughness that there was nothing left to document. Elizabeth read the final agreement in Mr. Pruitt's office on a Wednesday afternoon in early July, in the smell of old paper and linseed oil, with fellows sitting quietly in the corner, and Mr. Pruitt standing beside her with the patience of a man who has been waiting for this moment for 23 years and has no intention of rushing it. She read every page, every clause, every condition. Then she signed it. Her name in her mother's handwriting. She had always had her mother's handwriting, the same backward lean, the same decisive close on the final letters, looked very clear and very permanent on the white page. "Well done, Your Grace," Mr. Pruitt said quietly. "Well done to you," Elizabeth said, "and to my mother." "Indeed," he said, "to Lady Miriam." Elizabeth stood, straightened her gloves, and looked out the window at Chancery Lane below. The street was busy with the ordinary traffic of a London Wednesday, clerks with documents, barristers in wigs hurrying between buildings, a flower seller at the corner making an argument for roses that a passing gentleman was declining to find persuasive. She watched all of it with the specific pleasure of a woman who has just closed one chapter and feels, for the first time, entirely ready to open another. She attended the Castleton ball that Friday. This was deliberate. Several people had wondered audibly whether she would appear at any social function before the season ended, and Elizabeth had decided, with the advice of no one, which was itself a novelty she was finding she enjoyed, that she would appear at the Castleton ball because Lady Castleton was a woman she genuinely liked, and whose annual event was always worth attending, and she was no longer in the business of arranging her life around what other people might think of her choices. She wore deep blue silk. She wore her mother's pearl earrings. She did not wear the brooch. That was not for tonight. She arrived at 9:30, which was late enough to be composed and early enough to be seen. She greeted Lady Castleton with warmth, accepted a glass of champagne, and spent the first 20 minutes in conversation with an elderly general she had always found unexpectedly interesting on the subject of military logistics. If anyone had been hoping for drama from her entrance, the conversation with the general was not what they had imagined. But she was watched. She was aware of being watched, and she allowed it, because she understood that the watching had its own function. Society needed to see her in blue silk, with her champagne, discussing logistics with a general, because society needed to know what to do with her, and what to do with her depended on how she presented herself in the first significant public appearance after everything that had happened. She presented herself as a woman who had won, and found winning entirely unsurprising. The effect, she was told later by Louisa, was remarkable. "You looked," Louisa said, "like someone who had simply come to a ball." "I had simply come to a ball," Elizabeth said. "Yes, but after everything," Louisa shook her head with something between admiration and exasperation. "How did you manage to look so normal?" Elizabeth thought about this. "Because I am normal," she said. "I was always normal, that was rather the point." Richard appeared at the ball at 11. He came alone. He spoke to several people. He did not approach Elizabeth, and she did not approach him, and this managed distance, the particular choreography of two people who have reached an understanding and are demonstrating to an audience that is watching very carefully that the understanding holds, was itself a kind of communication. They were seen to exist in the same room without incident. Society noted this. Society noted everything. What society also noted, and would continue to note, in drawing rooms and at card parties and over morning calls for the remainder of the season and into the next, was the specific quality of Elizabeth's presence at that ball. The composure that was not coldness. The ease that was not indifference. The way she moved through the rooms as though she had, sometime recently, taken up more space than she had previously occupied, and found the additional space entirely natural. Lady Beaumont said, at a breakfast the following week, that the Duchess of Ashford had always had excellent posture, but that on Friday night she had looked somehow taller. No one could explain this precisely, but everyone who had been there agreed. On the last evening before she left London to return to Ashford Park, Elizabeth walked. This was something she rarely did in the city. The streets were not designed for solitary women, and she had always found London's particular scale more overwhelming than energizing. But the evening was fine, the light still gold at 7:30, and she felt a need to move that the confines of the hotel suite could not accommodate. She walked with her maid at a discreet distance, along Piccadilly and into the Green Park, where the summer evening had brought out the usual population of nurses with perambulators and young couples, testing the boundaries of what was permissible in a public space, and old men on benches with newspapers they were only pretending to read. She walked for an hour. She thought about her mother. She thought about Margaret in Bath, learning Italian and writing letters with the directness Elizabeth had always encouraged. She thought about Ashford Park, the Rose Garden, the East Wing, the view from the upper landing on a clear morning when the light came in at exactly the right angle and turned the whole staircase gold. She thought about the Wiltshire estate, which she had never seen, which had been sitting in her mother's legacy for 23 years waiting for her to be ready to claim it. She thought about what came next. This was the question that had been waiting behind everything else, patient as her mother had taught her to be patient, unwilling to be rushed. The legal matter was resolved. The terms were set. The season would end. Life, her actual life, the one that existed independent of the marriage and the management and the careful economy of strength she had practiced for 6 years, would resume, or perhaps begin, or perhaps both. Because she was 36 years old and there was, she had decided, a great deal of time left. Not for a different husband, she had no interest in that. For everything else. She stopped at a bench near the far end of the park and sat for a moment, in the evening light, watching a small child chase a pigeon with the absolute conviction that this time, surely, the pigeon would be caught. The pigeon, as pigeons do, was not caught. Elizabeth smiled. She stood. She straightened her gloves. She began the walk back toward the hotel, through the gold evening light of a London July, with the particular step of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and is in no hurry to get there, because the destination has been secured and the journey now, finally, belongs to her. 5 years later, Ashford Park in October was a different thing entirely from Ashford Park in any other season. The roses were long finished, the gardens pulled back into themselves with the dignified retreat of things that know they will return, And the light, that particular October light that came low and amber through the old beeches along the drive, turned the stone of the house into something that looked less like architecture and more like memory. Like a place that had been dreaming of itself for centuries and was content to keep dreaming. Elizabeth had always loved it best in autumn. She was in the rose garden when she heard the carriage, not the roses themselves, which were bare canes and clipped structure at this time of year, but the space of them, the geometry of the beds, the smell of turned earth where the undergardener had been working that morning. She had her hands in her pockets, which was not a duchess's posture and which she had entirely stopped caring about, and she was looking at the far bed where she had, 3 weeks ago, made the decision to move the damask roses 2 feet to the left to improve their access to the morning light. She was still deciding whether she had been right. The carriage came up the drive and stopped at the front, and Elizabeth turned and walked around the side of the house and arrived at the entrance just as Margaret stepped out. Her daughter was 20 years old. This still surprised Elizabeth sometimes. Not that Margaret had grown, which was the ordinary work of time and entirely expected, but that she had grown into someone so specifically and so entirely herself. She was taller than Elizabeth by 2 inches. She had Richard's dark hair and Elizabeth's jaw and her grandmother Lady Miriam's eyes, which appeared in every generation like a message being passed forward. She moved with the confidence of a young woman who had been raised to take up her full amount of space and had taken it, and then found that the space was not quite enough and had quietly expanded into more. Elizabeth had found this, from the beginning, deeply satisfying. "You're early," Elizabeth said. "I took the faster road," Margaret said, kissing her mother's cheek. "I told you I would. You didn't believe me." "I believed you entirely. I simply expected the road to offer more resistance." Margaret laughed. It was Richard's laugh, which Elizabeth had made her peace with years ago, because the things we inherit are not the things we choose, and Margaret had inherited his laugh and his posture, and absolutely none of his talent for arrogance, and turned to direct the unloading of her trunk with the brisk authority of someone who has learned, from a very specific example, that households run best when someone is paying clear attention. Elizabeth watched her and felt the thing she always felt watching Margaret manage something. A warmth so complete it was almost structural, like sunlight that has been stored in stone all day and radiates back in the evening. "Come inside," she said. "Mrs. Hartwell has made the ginger cake. The good one, or the one she makes when she thinks I won't notice the difference." "She knows you always notice. She made the good one." They had tea in the small sitting room, Elizabeth's sitting room, which had been rearranged twice in the past 5 years, and now looked nothing like it had when the cedarwood box had sat in the locked drawer of the writing desk. The desk was still there. The drawer was still there. But the box lived on the mantelpiece now, openly, next to a small watercolor of the Wiltshire countryside that Elizabeth had commissioned from a local painter the summer she had finally visited the estate. Margaret always looked at the box when she came into the room. Not ostentatiously, just a brief acknowledgement, a glance, the way one looks at something that has always been present, and whose presence means something particular. They talked for 2 hours over tea, and then over the remains of the ginger cake, in the way that Elizabeth and Margaret had always talked, without the elaborate social machinery that most conversations required, without the performance of interest or the management of impression. Simply 2 people saying what they meant in a room that was warm and familiar. Margaret talked about London. She was in her 2nd season, which was going well by most measures and which she was finding. She admitted this with the directness Elizabeth had always encouraged, somewhat tedious in its repetitions. "Every ball is the same ball," she said. "Different wallpaper, same conversations, the same men saying the same things about the same subjects and expecting to be found interesting." "Some of them are interesting," Elizabeth said. "Some of them," Margaret agreed. "A minority, And they're never the ones who expect to be found interesting, which is its own kind of lesson, I suppose. She looked at her mother. You always said that. Did I? You said, watch the ones who aren't performing. The ones who are performing are showing you the performance. The ones who aren't are showing you something real. She tilted her head. I've been watching. It takes patience. Most useful things do, Elizabeth said. Margaret was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup in her hands with the absent thoughtfulness that meant she was working up to something. There is someone, she said. Elizabeth waited. He is not, Margaret paused, choosing her words with a care that told Elizabeth the choosing mattered. He is not what anyone would immediately select. He is a second son. His family has a respectable name and a modest estate in Derbyshire and no particular social brilliance. He is not fashionable. Another pause. He is kind. He is genuinely interested in things, real things, not performance things. He asked me, at the Pemberton dinner, what I thought about the enclosure debates, and when I told him what I thought, he disagreed with 2 of my points and explained why, and then he listened to my response and said that I had changed his mind on one of them. She looked up. He changed his mind, she said, out loud, without it costing him anything. Elizabeth looked at her daughter for a long moment. What is his name? Mr. Daniel Forsyth. A small smile. He is coming to the Ashby House party in November. Caroline has invited him because I asked her to, and because she met him once and thought he had excellent sense. Caroline has never been wrong about excellent sense, Elizabeth said. No, Margaret set down her teacup. I'm not in love with him. I want to be clear about that. I am not telling you this because I am lost in a feeling I can't think around. I am telling you because I think he might be worth knowing better, and I wanted you to know I was paying attention. Elizabeth felt something move through her chest, something warm and complicated and made of several things at once. The way feelings are when they have been collecting for a long time and finally have space to arrive. Her daughter was 20 years old, and she was paying attention. She was watching the ones who weren't performing. She was not confusing a kind man for an uninteresting one. She was not mistaking the absence of arrogance for the absence of substance. Elizabeth thought about herself at 20, about the engagement and her father's frank conversation, and the 2 questions she had asked about her correspondence and her mother's properties. She had been paying attention too, at 20, but she had been paying the attention of a young woman who had learned to protect herself within a system she didn't yet know she could question. Margaret was paying a different kind of attention. The attention of a young woman who had been shown, by example and by architecture and by a cedarwood box on a mantelpiece, that the terms were negotiable, that the ground could be solid, that you could require more than endurance. Good, Elizabeth said. Tell me more about him. Later, after dinner, after Margaret had gone up to bed with the immediate unconsciousness of the young and healthy, Elizabeth sat alone in her sitting room. The fire was low. The house was quiet in the way that large old houses are quiet, not empty, but settled, breathing slowly in the dark. She could hear, very faintly, the wind in the beeches along the drive. She picked up the cedarwood box from the mantelpiece. She opened it. The brooch lay against the dark interior, the seed pearls, the oval frame, the miniature face looking up at her with the composed expression that Elizabeth had been looking at her entire life and still, sometimes, found things in. Her mother's jaw, her mother's dark eyes, the particular set of the mouth that appeared in Elizabeth's mirror every morning and had, apparently, made its way forward another generation. She thought about Lady Miriam at 30, sitting in a vestry handing a sealed document to a country vicar and saying, "When the time is correct, you will know." She thought about the patience that required, not the passive patience of a woman with no options, but the active patience of a woman who has made arrangements and is willing to wait for them to become necessary, who loves her daughter enough to build a floor beneath her that the daughter doesn't yet know is there. She thought about what it cost to do that, to hold that knowledge quietly through years of a difficult marriage and a body failing, and a death that came before you could see whether any of it had worked. Her mother had not known. She had built the architecture and then she had died, and she had not known whether Elizabeth would ever need it, or find it, or understand it for what it was. Elizabeth sat with this for a long time. She thought about the letter she still had, somewhere in her correspondence box, from Mr. Pruitt, the first one, the one that had said, "Your mother asked me to make myself available to you when the time came. I am glad the time has come." Her mother had trusted a solicitor and a vicar and a sealed covenant and a brooch attached to a legal clause, and she had trusted her daughter. The 7-year-old, the 20-year-old, the woman Elizabeth had not yet become, to be the kind of person who would eventually know what to do with all of it. She had been right. Elizabeth thought that was perhaps the most extraordinary thing, not the legal victory, not the hearing, not the terms negotiated in Mr. Pruitt's office with its smell of old paper. Those were the instruments. The extraordinary thing was the faith. The faith of a woman who could not see the future, who did not know what kind of marriage her daughter would have, or what kind of man she would marry, or whether the circumstances the covenant anticipated would ever arise, and who had nonetheless built it all carefully, quietly, thoroughly, because she loved Elizabeth enough to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. "I understand now," Elizabeth had said to the empty room in the Pulteney Hotel 5 years ago. She understood more now. She understood that her mother had not only been protecting her, she had been teaching her. Every clause of that covenant was a lesson. Every carefully placed piece of the architecture was an instruction in how to love someone practically. How to love them in the future tense, in the conditional tense, in the tense that says, "I do not know what you will face, but I am building you something to stand on when you face it." Elizabeth had been learning that lesson for 36 years. She was teaching it now. Not through documents, though documents had their place and Margaret would have hers, and Mr. Pruitt's son, who had taken over his father's practice, was already on retainer for exactly this reason, but also through the conversations over tea, through "watch the ones who aren't performing," through the directness she had modeled and the patience she had demonstrated and the particular quality of attention she had tried, every day of Margaret's life, to show her daughter that the world deserved. Through the fact that Margaret, at 20, had said "I am not in love with him" before she said anything else, had separated the feeling from the thinking and offered them both clearly, without confusion, without apology. Had paid attention. Elizabeth set the brooch back in the box. She did not close it immediately. She sat for another moment, looking at her mother's face in the firelight. "She is going to be all right," she said. Not a question, a statement. The kind of thing you say to someone who worried about something for a long time and deserves to know how it turned out. The fire shifted, a log settled, the wind moved in the beeches. Elizabeth closed the box. She stood, straightened, not from habit, not from performance, but from the simple animal pleasure of a body that has been sitting and is ready to move, and carried the box back to the mantelpiece and placed it in its position next to the watercolor of the Wiltshire countryside. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to her desk, sat down, and opened her correspondence box. She had 3 letters to write before morning. One to Mr. Pruitt's son regarding the Wiltshire tenancy renewal, one to Caroline Ashby thanking her for the November invitation and confirming Margaret's attendance, and one to a woman in Edinburgh who was doing interesting work on the legal status of married women's property, and had written to Elizabeth 3 months ago asking for her account of the Covenant case. Elizabeth had been thinking about how to answer that last letter for 3 months. She picked up her pen. She wrote at the top of the page in her mother's handwriting, the backward lean, the decisive close. "Dear Mrs. Campbell, *. You asked what I would want other women to know. I have been considering this question with the seriousness it deserves. The answer is not simple, but I will try to make it plain. What I would want them to know is this: the ground can be made solid, not by accident, not by hoping, not by enduring without purpose, but by building. By thinking carefully about what you want to protect and then protecting it, as thoroughly and as quietly as the circumstances allow. By trusting that the work done in ordinary moments, in vestries and solicitors' offices and locked drawers and sealed letters, is not less real than the dramatic gesture. It is more real. It is the thing that holds. My mother built a floor beneath me that I did not know existed until I needed to stand on it. I am building one beneath my daughter. I do not know what she will face. I am building it anyway. That is, I think, what love looks like when it is also intelligent. I remain yours sincerely. Elizabeth Ann Montclair * Duchess of Ashford. She read it back. She added one line at the bottom, below her signature, in smaller letters. P.S. The brooch is on the mantelpiece. One day it will belong to my daughter. One day after that to hers. It has witnessed a great deal of disappointment, as my mother said, but it has also witnessed survival. That is what I would have them know. She sanded the page. She folded it. She sealed it with the Ashford crest, her crest, on her letters in her house, and set it with the others. Then she banked the fire, turned down the lamp, and walked through the quiet house to bed. Outside, the wind moved through the beeches along the drive, and the old stone of Ashford Park held the last of the day's warmth the way stone does, slowly, thoroughly, longer than you would expect. The way certain things do when they have been built to last. The Duke of Ashford died in the winter of 1831, leaving the title and entailed estates to a distant male cousin, as was required by the terms of the entail. The Duchess of Ashford outlived him by 22 years. Margaret Montclair married Mr. Daniel Forsyth of Derbyshire in the spring of 1823. He was, by all accounts, exactly what she had believed him to be. The brooch passed to Margaret on the morning of her wedding. She wore it. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We always love seeing how many different places around the world are represented here, and reading your thoughts is one of the best parts of sharing these stories with you. Over time, this channel has grown into a wonderful community of listeners who enjoy historical drama, unforgettable characters, and stories filled with love, heartbreak, resilience, and second chances. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or this is the very first story you've heard on the channel, we're grateful that you chose to spend part of your day with us. We've now shared well over 100 stories together, and your support, comments, and encouragement have helped make that possible. Every kind message, every discussion in the comments, and every subscription helps this channel continue to grow. And if you'd like to support the channel even further, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support truly helps us continue bringing these stories to life and creating many more for you in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.